Jeremy Narby, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's excited to meet you. Your name popped up very early in my own sort of process of, I don't know, I hate to use the word awakening, but sort of my process of learning more about myself and the spiritual elements of my life. Probably back in 2008. When your other book, The Cosmic Serpent, what year did that come out?
Came out in '98 in New York.
Man,
Uh,
you were way ahead of your time.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, you have a new book, Plant Teachers, that came across my radar. And so it was a good excuse for us to connect. And I have a lot of things I'd like to talk to you about. But maybe first, for those who aren't as initiated into your work, you could just give us a little bit of background about kind of, how you got into this work so early and just a little bit about who you are.
yeah. Let's see. I was born in Montreal 61 years ago, and then when I was 10, my parents moved to Switzerland. So I was
Okay.
all. Plus, we were like English-speaking Quebecers. So I was born on a cultural frontier. Um, and then we moved to another bilingual town in Switzerland. So I've always been, I've grown up in places where people speak different languages and so on. And I think that kind of predisposes one to ask oneself questions about why people have different cultures and so on. So I ended up becoming an anthropologist, that's what anthropologists study. And I was interested in differences between rich and poor more than anything else. It was kind of like a
Mm-hmm.
political focus on
Mm-hmm.
justice in the world. And a professor at university in anthropology suggested that I look into indigenous people because these were people who lived in out of the way places and that somehow were the Achilles heel of any kind of development scheme. Um, it could be in a rainforest or in the Arctic or in the Australian desert. These indigenous people lived in these vast places of natural resources, but didn't use them in ways that experts felt were rational. And so the idea was that if you studied the situation of indigenous people, you could find a place where there was friction in in what were programs to bring about development. So it was for those theoretical reasons that I became interested in the indigenous people of the Amazon. At that point, as a 23, 24-year-old anthropologist in the 1980s, I was not attracted to the rainforest and the mosquitoes. This answer is getting kind of long already, but
No, this is great. This is really helping me out understand, like,
because it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it nice and short. Um, Yes, so for theoretical reasons, and also when you're a young anthropologist, it's kind of like when you're studying to become a medical doctor. You go and do your internship in the place where it's difficult, like the emergency room or something. Not
yeah.
because you wanna, but that's going to steel you and make you a real, doctor. So, in other words, if you're not attracted to it, it must be the place to go. So that's how I showed up in the Peruvian Amazon. And I was expecting that the indigenous people that I was going to live with and study would be different. And, Indians in the rainforest with bare feet and machetes, maybe, and arrows and face paint. And all that was true. And at the same time, what soon became apparent was that, well, first of all, this forest was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The diversity of plants left Swiss forests, Canadian forests, American forests in the dust in terms of the diversity, also the size. I mean, the redwoods notwithstanding. Um, and these people had impressive encyclopedic knowledge about these plants. I mean, you could go walking in the forest with different individuals, and they'd have names in their language for just about every species of plant.
Mm.
And and described uses to about half of them. Um, so that was the first. There have been a series of things that have got me to look at all this rather differently. I mean, that was like the first lesson. And these people have more botanical knowledge than scientists in the sense that there are simply more names given to Amazonian plants in indigenous languages than in Latin given by science. You know, that they really do have bona fide knowledge that is on the same footing as our own, if not superior to it, at least in that domain.
That's
Um,
wild. I mean, I just want to ask you, I mean, in that way, do you think there's a promise for plants still to come in a way of like, particularly the Amazon, for like things that have still yet to have been discovered or
Well, you know,
understood?
that's a pretty speculative question because indigenous people have been living there for a long time, studying the plants. And I think that a good part of what is known about plants is already in the public domain, as it were. This is not to say that there aren't plants that you know still might be discovered and have properties that are unknown. I think plants are very powerful organisms. I mean, the simplest plants can contain complex molecules that no other plant contains, and you know, clearly the plants of the Amazon warrant more research. But if we're going to be discovering blockbusters that haven't been discovered by indigenous people yet, who knows? That's an open question. In any case, here were these Ashaninka people. I was living within the Peruvian Amazon. They had this remarkable knowledge about plants, but when I would ask them how they got their knowledge, they said they pointed to plants like ayahuasca, plants like tobacco, precisely. These plants are teachers to us.
Right.
And so, how do we know what we know? Well, we ingest these plants and then we see images and get information about other plants. That's how we know. So, that was an enigma that was plopped into my lap as a young anthropologist. I wanted to demonstrate the contrary. I wanted to show that indigenous people used the rainforest rationally and therefore deserved the right to own their lands.
Hmm.
I wanted to show that they used it productively and without destroying it, unlike any other actors in the Amazon. And that if we were really interested in developing the Amazon in a sustainable way, it was necessary to work with indigenous people and respect their land rights. So that's what I was up to. So this hallucinogenic source of knowledge that they plopped in my lap was uh, uh, burdensome, cumbersome. I mean, it wasn't, and yet it was still interesting. I'd previously tried LSD. I mean, LSD is a Swiss molecule, and I grew up in Switzerland. I'd tried psilocybin mushrooms before. I mean, I had a dabbling experience as a college kid in psychedelics in the early 1980s. I'd even spent a month with Humphrey Osmond in Alabama. He's the English psychiatrist who coined the term psychedelic. This was 3 or 4 years before going to the Amazon, so I was fairly well versed for your average Westerner in hallucinogens. At least I thought I was when I showed up. I also knew that it wasn't by studying the hallucinogens that I was going to advance my anthropological career. Um, so I had a kind of a personal interest in this. So here were these actually kind of mind blowing people. I mean, they were barefoot. They did put paint on their face, you know, vegetal colors on their face, but they had remarkable knowledge about their environment and they pointed to these powerful hallucinogenic plants. Ayahuasca is a powerful plant mixture from the Amazon. Tobacco also comes from South America. It's a very powerful plant when it's the strong, dark Amazonian tobacco. So I was curious as a kind of hobby, or I didn't really consider it as part of my official research. It was more like okay, Friday night, next Friday night, this young ayahuasquero told me, look, if you want to understand how we know what we know about plants, you have to drink ayahuasca, brother Jeremy. And it's the television of the forest. You'll see images and learn things. I said, okay, next Friday night, bring it over and let's look into it. Anyway, this is becoming a very long answer to your question, but that's how
Well,
I kind
it's a
of
big question. It's a big question.
that's how
So,
I fell into the cauldron, as it were.
well, so the book centers around ayahuasca and tobacco, and that makes a fair bit of sense to me over my experiences over the last 13 years. And I think I spent a little time in the Amazon and did a 10-day dieta outside of Terapoto with uh, an, quite an older ayahuasquero and vegetalista. And that was a valuable experience just to kind of be on the ground there and just be way out there in a very, very traditional sense. And I was interested in experiencing what it would be like because that's what it had been like. Like I didn't want all the frills, which wasn't so fun, but I learned a lot. And tobacco was very present. That those big stalks of sort of that jungle tobacco you could buy in the market. I remember bringing that as a gift. I was told to get to bring that and mapacho and seeing how that is used. And I remember being told, someone said, like, if you had a desert island plant, if you could take one plant with you, what would it be as a teacher and an ally? And they said tobacco. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people in the West. And for myself, I had been sort of unconsciously using marijuana and mixed with tobacco. It got a hold on me one year in my life early on. And I had a particular accident on a bicycle where I horribly broke my arm, and while it happened partially because I was smoking while I was riding, and I got that rush. And long story short, I made a decision when that happened. I remember lying on the ground in horrific pain, and instantly said, I will never again smoke tobacco in this way. And as someone who leads ceremonies with psilocybin, the only time I work with tobacco is in the ceremony as needed, mostly to clear the space and as a protector. That's it, and that's stayed to this day because something inherent it was speaking to me in a way of understanding the power of this plant, and I just did that out of respect for what I've heard and what I've learned. I'm like, I don't need to think I have some understanding of tobacco, like, oh, I can have it both ways, my cake and eat it too. So let's talk a little bit about tobacco first and why that's viewed as such a powerful plant, and also then why it's so has such a grip on our world in this addictive way. It seems to have these different. It's an like, and in the book it talks about the malice of tobacco, which I thought was a really interesting word. So tell me
Hmm.
what that brings up for you. Let's talk about tobacco.
Okay. Yeah, this is another one of these questions. It looks simple, but
No, no, it's
I think
deep.
the only way to answer it is to kind of unpack it.
Yeah.
And so um, it, I think with tobacco, it's important to kind of rewind the tape of time, and because and I'll say indigenous Amazonians on the one hand, and I'll say white people on the other, as a kind of telegraphic code to go faster with the story. Um, you know, the the white people from Europe who came over as of 1500 to the Americas and then became North Americans and so on. Um, they didn't know tobacco. They didn't have tobacco. They didn't smoke. They didn't even have a verb for to smoke. When they saw the first Columbus and his men, when they saw people in the Caribbean smoking tobacco,
Wow.
they said they drink the smoke, because they didn't have the concept of to smoke. Um, well, the tobacco that is smoked in the world, Nicotiana tabacum and also Nicotiana rustica, these two species of tobacco, because there are like 67 or 76 species in the Nicotiana family. But the two that are most smoked or commonly smoked in the world come from South America. They're indigenous to the area around Tarapoto, it would seem. That's where they grew naturally, and that's where people first domesticated them and started cultivating them, no doubt thousands of years ago. And then tobacco travels very easily with people. In other words, once people start working with tobacco, then they value the plant and transmit it, and then it's fairly easy to cultivate. So tobacco spread across the indigenous Americas. It's not just that Amazonians are the only ones to smoke, but it's true that the plant itself comes from there. They have the deepest experience using it. And for them, and like Nicotiana rustica, which grows in the Amazon, it has like 20% nicotine compared to 1% in the Virginia blonde
Yeah.
tobacco.
It's
That
very strong. Yeah.
it's very strong.
Yeah.
So and in fact, it's so strong that it's a kind of hallucinogen. I mean, people do not usually classify tobacco in that way, but people who are familiar with the strength of dark Amazonian shamanic tobacco, recognize that it has hallucinogenic properties. I mean, you see images, you have scenarios come through your mind, your body has all these strange impressions. Can be a very powerful experience. Um, and so then it is also a painkiller, an analgesic. I mean, you take fresh tobacco leaves and you put them on wounds, and it reduces the pain. And tobacco is used as the number one medicinal plant in indigenous Amazonia. People apply it, they chew it, they smoke it and blow the smoke on people who are ill. Um, Before being a visionary and shamanic plant, it is a medicinal plant. And then it is also the number one shamanic plant. In other words, the plant that is used most often. And for example, tobacco is often used with other teacher plants, like ayahuasca, for example.
Right.
It's the ultimate combo plant. I mean, even you were smoking cannabis and tobacco. Tobacco lends itself to being used with other psychoactive plants because it modulates the experience, and with psilocybin as well. I mean, tobacco functions as a kind of MAO inhibitor as well, and shamans commonly use tobacco to modulate their experience with hallucinogenic plants. And this means that tobacco is used you always use tobacco with ayahuasca, but you don't always use ayahuasca with tobacco. In other words, so it ends up that tobacco gets used more frequently than any plant for shamanic reasons and also for medicinal reasons. So it's the number one plant, and it's a plant teacher. It's regarded as a powerful entity, and by setting up an alliance with this plant, you can learn things, you can get some kind of power, but it does have that two-faced nature of most plant teachers, according to, for example, my co-author Rafael Chanchari, who is an Amazonian expert on these subjects. He says these plant teachers, they all have two souls, two faces, medicine and malice. And it's true in the Amazonian view of the world. They make less sort of absolute separations between good and evil, medicine and malice, and so these entities, like the powerful entity that is tobacco, can be used to harm people, can be used to heal people. Um, it's precisely because power itself is double edged. Um, Knowledge is double edged. Um, if we just compare the plant, a good Western metaphor is like a power tool. Indigenous Amazonians compare the plant to a person. I'll be a good Westerner and compare it to an object. I'll say, okay, the plant is like a power tool. Um, Where it's like a power tool is like if you think of a chainsaw, you can use a chainsaw to do good work. You can also use it to do bad work. Um, so you have to learn how to master it. And that's the whole thing, is that you can quickly go wrong with a chainsaw if you don't know what you're doing. Um, and that's how it is with these powerful plants. They can quickly mislead you. Um, and so there it is. The master plants. You never master plants. They may master you, and that's what you want to avoid. And you avoid that by confining them in space and time. You don't use them all the time. You use them only at certain moments with certain purposes. You prepare yourself. If you're going to work with these plants, you have to take it seriously. Otherwise, it gets tricky fast.
But
That's
but
the
is excuse me, I just am curious, isn't there an interesting difference between ayahuasca and tobacco and that the physical addictive properties of nicotine? Like, yeah,
well.
it mentions talking like smoking
Oh,
tobacco during the day,
I'll,
right?
I'll get to that.
Yeah,
I'll get
okay.
to the addictive part about tobacco because it's coming right up.
Great.
Um, when this powerful plant was taken out of the indigenous world and brought into the white man world, in Virginia, for example, and they started making this weakened version, blonde tobacco, much less nicotine, because in the culture of these white European originally people, having your head spin in a kind of hallucinatory way was not part of their culture. They didn't like that part. The shamanic tobacco was too strong, so they selected for weaker tobacco, and then there was a pleasure. It became a pleasurable experience. And in the 20th century, it became industrial cigarettes. And we're going to get to addiction very quickly here. Industrial cigarettes, by the admission of the people who owned the tobacco companies, are nicotine delivery devices. They're constructed like that. So you take this weakened form of this powerful plant. They lace it with hundreds of chemicals, which, when burned, turn into dangerous substances. Um, and they calibrate it just so that you get just enough nicotine to tickle the neurons, but not actually to deliver. There's never a real delivery. It's like a gear when you have a motorcycle goes bam 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 bam, and you never put the gear in bam. You never actually. It's just enough to get the motor going. Beam 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 beam. Okay, that's right. So you've tickled your neurons, and then 25 minutes later, you want to fire up another one. And that's what they want. They calibrate the nicotine and the taste experience so that you come back to it as quickly as possible. They turn a powerful plant into a watered down plant that teaches you nothing. And they turn it into an addiction because at that level, and they turn it into an experience. Uh, if you actually get a full nicotine delivery, you don't want to have another one anytime soon. If you have a powerful, a big dose of nicotine-rich dark shamanic tobacco one evening during one of these sessions, you don't want to fire up a cigarette the next morning or the next afternoon. Um, you may smoke some mapacho the next day to get back into that space. I'm not saying that people don't do that, but the addiction, I'm quite sure, lies in the way of consuming this plant uh, in a weakened and adulterated form. So
What
again,
ab
so that begs the question: do tobacco shamans in the Amazon show addiction to nicotine?
hmm.
I would say mainly no. uh, Hanging around with Westerners who have that kind of addictive approach to tobacco and who will fire up their tobacco in the late morning or in the early afternoon, there are perhaps some South American ayahuasquero tabaqueros who get into that. But mainly, no. Just like you and your psilocybin use of tobacco, most tabaqueros are using tobacco when they're doing serious tobacco shaman business, but
What
not
about
not during the.
vaping? What about like in high-end vaping situations where people claim to have just a very pure delivery of nicotine and they're like they're using nicotine as a tool throughout the day? What are your opinions on that?
Well, that's interesting because I didn't know that there were people who were vaping tobacco and working with it in that way. I mean, the first thing that I'd say about that is that it does depend on the tobacco. Um,
Sure.
you know, uh, and I can say what my co-author Rafael Chanchari, because I asked him, do you have any advice for Westerners who smoke tobacco? In the form of cigarettes, but what'd be your advice? And he said, well, look, the first thing is you want to smoke pure tobacco. So, and it can even be the weaker kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be strong, but at least it should be pure. So, just tobacco, not mixed with chemicals. And then, in his view, it's important to limit this to doing it in the evenings, um, and doing it when you're not doing something else, like, for example, riding a bicycle. Um,
I
but
can concur.
but he said, don't smoke whilst you're watching television. Television is another activity. It's something that enchants you. It takes your mind. If you're going to smoke, smoke in a way where you concentrate on the fact that you are smoking, you are interacting with a powerful plant, and at this point, you're listening to the plant, or like having it's like if you and I are going to have a conversation, then I'm going to be attentive to you and to what you're saying, and I'm not going to be having a conversation with somebody else. And so that's how to. And so somebody who is vaping tobacco throughout the day. I First, there's a health problem with vaping, and we kind of put that in the appendix of the
Appendix,
book.
yeah.
But like vaporizing, I think it would be possible to vaporize pure tobacco. But the point would not be to do it throughout the day, but to do it in a way where you do it deliberately. Kind of like a prayer or a meditation. I mean, I'm not a religious person, just to be clear, but when you think of when I think of Muslims who pray 5 times a day, it's quite a rigmarole. You've got to go and you interrupt your activities and you get down and you do the thing and but praying 5 times a day is it's not a full time job, but I mean it really plays takes up a lot of time in people's life. S- Smoking tobacco seriously 5 times a day um, really is something similar to that. I mean, if you really are going to take it, I don't know, 10 minutes, five to 10 minutes, where you go to a place where there's nobody else except some maybe other smokers, so that you don't disturb them, and then concentrate on the fact that it's you and the tobacco. Um, if people want to do that 5 times a day whilst they're writing their things or so on, you know, I don't know if it's not up to me to say whether they should do it 3 or 5 times a day or only three
Sure.
times a week or whatever. I think the most important thing is that each time that you vaporize the plant or smoke it, or however you ingest the plant, do it with intention, concentration, focus, humility, and a knowledge of what you're doing. And what you're doing is interacting with a powerful plant. Um, that can be dangerous. Actually, tobacco. This is one of the differences between tobacco and ayahuasca. I think tobacco is like it's almost unsafe at any speed. I mean, it really is like a wild horse. It's powerful. It has a deep impact on us. Uh, I think it's easy to get into trouble with tobacco. It's not something that's easy to master. but it clearly inspires many people, and many people are attracted to it. Um, I happen not to be one. I'm just not a tobacco user. I hang out with tobacco users. I occasionally take a hit from tobacco just to confirm that it's really not my thing. Um, but then there's more than 1.2 billion people in the world who consume tobacco, mainly in the form of industrial cigarettes. So there's certainly a lot of people out there who could gain from um, clarifying, I think,
Right.
what they're doing.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit to ayahuasca. And in some ways, this certainly relates. You mentioned in the book that maybe it was Chinchari was saying like ayahuasca doesn't deceive. Like it sort of just speaks its truth. But there's this delineation between in your experience of ayahuasca, truth and hallucination, or truth versus projections.
Mm.
I think this is a really important subject and something to get into because a lot of people go into sessions and they have these experiences and they have sometimes sorts of revelations where like they kind of think they've figured something out. And maybe, sometimes they have, but sometimes maybe they haven't. And how do people know and tell the difference between that delusion of sorts between a vision and projection or hallucination? And how do you talk about the two?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer, but for some reason I'm tempted to ask you what your answer to that question is first.
Well, I would say there isn't a clear cut answer. And it comes up, it rings true for me right now just because I heard a story last week of someone who is going through a sickness and they asked someone who was going to the jungle, hey, when you're in that space, please ask the ayahuasca for me, like what I can do. And the person came back and said, I did ask the ayahuasca. Ayahuasca told me I can heal you. And I'm not saying that's true or not true, but
Yeah.
that anytime someone tells me they have any answer with clarity, sort of like I know,
Hmm.
a red light goes off in my mind because anything I've learned is that I have feelings and I never know with certainty. It's sort of, or it's
Right,
even
right,
this is mythic. It's
right.
like, with a capital K, but you don't know with a little k. Like my mind wants to grab on and say, I figured it out, but I know
Yeah,
it's the mystery itself. And so, but humans have this wonderful way. I've seen a lot of people who get lost in these
yeah,
spaces and only you can really know inside that truth, but we have a lot of delusion and grandeur and so
yeah.
forth.
Well, very good, and I agree with what you say, and I think that what makes ayahuasca particularly tricky in on this question um, is that it does several things that are not necessarily bad. It impacts on ego. It can cause ego dissolution, like other hallucinogens. It can also cause ego amplification. The anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna has said that perhaps the biggest danger of ayahuasca is ego inflation.
Wow.
And so this doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to a small minority of people, I don't know, 10, 20%. And then suddenly, they think they know more than other people. And and then there is this, sorry, this other aspect. Um, Science would say ayahuasca is a psychedelic. And psychedelics are, um, well, they're amplifiers. Um, and they're also revealers of psyche. It's like they take the lid off and you go deeper into the psyche and stuff that's down there comes out. I don't think this explains everything about ayahuasca. I think the word psychedelic is only part of the story, but it is also part of the story. And so, ayahuasca, the experience that you have of ayahuasca depends on who you are. It depends on what's inside your psyche. It's going to amplify stuff that's there. It can amplify your ego. And then I mean, a classic is you have beginners who go down there and then they come back and say, "Yes, ayahuasca told me I'm a great shaman, and I've got to learn ayahuasca, so on and so forth." And
Yeah.
it's not that ayahuasca told them that; is that some part deep down inside themselves that sort of that got amplified, and they heard it, and they took it to be, and it's what they also wanted to hear, and stuff like that. So ayahuasca is good at making stuff like that come out, come bubbling out, and then people go down, they go charging down certain alleys because they think they've received a clear message, and they can get misled in that way. um, my co-author Rafael Chanchari says, no, ayahuasca doesn't do the misleading, it's people who mislead themselves. Well, I mean, it depends from which perspective. I think it's still, if you look at the plant as a psychedelic, it's still the plant that's doing the amplifying, doing the psyche revealing. So in that sense, yeah, it eventually does. It is generating what ends up being misleading for that person. So Rafael and I don't necessarily agree on that point. He lets the plant get off kind of lightly. At the same time, where I think he's right is that it really does depend on the people, and that people have to learn the difference between what they're carrying around inside them, and then that it comes out as a kind of projection uh, during the experience. And then what is really what Raphael calls a true vision, where you're getting information that is independent to a certain extent of what you've been carrying around in your psyche, and that he calls true vision. And that finally, I mean, he has the answer of an old fox. So, how do you tell the difference? Well, it takes time. And that's the foxy answer, because it just means you have to keep at it for years. That actually, during the first years that you start learning from a plant, it's important not to consider this as true vision, because you haven't yet learned to determine whether it's true vision or projection. In other words, people who are at the beginning of the ayahuasca learning curve really gain from being humble, and as you say, embracing a position where you don't have certitudes. Maybe the plant told me that, or maybe I was suggesting it to myself. um, Maybe this was just a possible scenario. Not immediately turning your visions into certitudes with capital C. In fact, avoiding certitudes, learning to live with mystery. That so yes, you can work with ayahuasca. It can certainly increase your sense of mystery. There's all kinds of mystery in the world. Um, so it's like learning to ride a wild horse or something. It's something that does take time, and it's important not to just go charging down the first avenues and reaching sweeping conclusions filled with certitude.
Is that what Chinchari meant when he's talking about learning sorcery? Like some people, it's like almost like an avenue. You're going one way with it versus another way with it. I wasn't quite sure
Well,
what he meant.
you take somebody who is power hungry,
Yeah.
um, uh, and kind of centered on themselves and so on, and then you give ayahuasca to this person. Um, it's not going to make them any better. It's going to exacerbate the problem. Um, so it really does. And once you start using ayahuasca for your own power, to have influence over people, um, yeah, I think that is the beginning of what they call sorcery in the Amazon. But then that too is a whole conceptual thicket. Um, I think probably the most pertinent thing that I saw recently on sorcery were these two French anthropologists who wrote that in a small scale egalitarian society like an indigenous Amazonian society, sorcery is a frame of interpretation that makes sense and that works. In the hyper individualized world where community has somehow disappeared, in the world that we now live in, of just hundreds of millions of individuals who are trying to move forward with their own personal agendas. The frame of interpretation that makes most sense is what is called psychology. So this means if you're trying to make sense of power games among many different individuals, psychology is a pretty good frame for starting to think about it. If you're in an Amazonian society and people are related to each other, everybody knows each other, and it's a small scale place, yes, their way of describing the power games among them, was sorcery, is a way of understanding their relations that makes sense, at least to them. And once you get used to it, you can start to see its logic. Um, so if that's true, it means that, yeah, when individuals from the Western world do their personal development, work on themselves and try to know more and get more personal power, depending on how they do it, it's not necessarily sorcery because we're not in the world of sorcery, but it can, I think, be looked at through the lens of psychology. And when you look at it through the lens of psychology, what you see is that some people, their egos get amplified. They become, they just get worse. They become narcissistic. They become messianic. They start, that you can get into very strange trips. And I think there are quite a few people who have done that. And this is, if you look at regrettable power games among ayahuasqueros, and you look at the indigenous and mestizo South American ayahuasqueros, there's no lack of power games and abuse of female customers and all kinds of problems. Um, and also sorcery wars between shamans. I mean, the anthropological literature is filled with occult sorcery that at least 50% of the ayahuasca world is not this light-filled, healing-filled scene. Um, well, likewise, if you look at North American and European ayahuasqueros, um, there's a lot of power games going on. There's abuse that's going on as well. Not everybody, and this hasn't really been studied, so I don't have the percentages. Um, but it's clear that when you dabble with powerful plants like ayahuasca and try to lead a life in the industrial world at the same time,
Yeah,
um, it can get complicated quickly.
that's for sure. Yeah. It can get complicated. Um, I really wanted to ask you about some music and the role of music, Ikaros, the healing songs that he's talked about. It's one of the things you can learn from ayahuasca. And myself, as a musician, this is something I'm interested in and talk about a lot. Um, what do you feel is the role of music in the psychedelic landscape? Let's just start there.
Okay, well, how about in the ayahuasca landscape, and then we can move on to the
Yes.
psychedelic
Let's
landscape.
just stick with ayahuasca for now. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
there's an anthropologist who's written very well on this subject. His name is Peter Gow. That's Gow. The book is called An Amazonian Myth and Its History. It may sound a little bit academic, but still. This guy spent time living with the Piro people, kind of just next door from the Ashaninka people where I was living with. And this is what he says. And to me, it's the best kind of summary of what's going on. People, in Amazonian people who take ayahuasca say that in their ayahuasca visions, they perceive entities that are common to all life forms that they call essences or mothers or fathers. So, like the mother of ayahuasca, so each species has an entity like this. And if you pay attention in your vision to these entities, you notice that they give off a vibration or a melody, and that the job of the shaman is to sing along with these entities and to learn their melodies. And these melodies are the essence of these beings. And so that you can, if you can remember the melody and then sing it later, you can call them. They're saying that the essences that animate life forms themselves have an essence, which is a melody. Do it again. The essence of living organisms is a melody,
It's
or
beautiful.
a bunch
Yeah.
of melodies. And that what these melodies are, they correspond ultimately to beings, beings that are made of knowledge and that are music. And what the shaman does by hanging out with these entities is learn uh, the different melodies that go with different species. And the more Icaros or shamanic song that a shaman has, it's more like a university professor. The more books she's written, the more powerful she is. So that's where we are with Icaros, and the interface, the possible interface. If you take these beings that can be perceived in visual hallucinations or visions, call them what you want, we can't emit visions, but we can emit sound. We can sing. These melodies emit sound. What these entities, emit sound, and they are made of sound. What we have in common, the only thing that we have in common with these invisible entities is sound. We can listen to their melody, and then we can replay it. And it seems that they actually like hearing their own melody. Um, so the music, it's not only that it's the essence of living beings, it's also it's the common substrate that we have with that invisible level.
I love everything you're saying. It just lights me up inside. The essence of the essence. I love this idea of the beings almost like enjoying hearing the reverberation of their own music.
and
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 it's
and
so
then
poetic.
there's just a little bit more, which is
Please.
that according to Peter Gao, according to the Piro, and these are things that I've been able to confirm with other indigenous Amazonian people. It's just that Peter Gao wrote it down first, and it was so clear. It's that so shamans put themselves in the presence of these entities. They pay attention to the melodies that they emit, and then they sing along with them to learn the melody. And learning singing along with them and singing their songs and learning their melodies, they start to see from their point of view. And when you start to see from the point of view of these powerful entities, this is both a very rich experience in terms of knowledge and therefore in terms of power. It's also dangerous because you start looking at humans from the outside, from the point of view of these powerful entities. You start looking at humans like a jaguar might look at a human. Um, this is dangerous. So you want the shaman to go and speak with the level of reality of the of the invisible entities, because you get knowledge from there. You get knowledge that you wouldn't have otherwise. But the shaman can be transformed by that experience and can come back knowledgeable, powerful, but dangerous. And so that is, we're not in music as entertainment here. We're in music as knowledge and power that can also be ambiguous. So that's what is um, behind the whole question of Icaros. No, just from a personal standpoint. Oh, well, uh, yeah, I'm a friend of psilocybin mushrooms, and I think it's pretty clear that, for example, one thing that one experiences, psilocybin for me is often more auditory than visual. Um, and so it's actually inclined to towards sound and being attentive to sound. Um, I think it also privileges the human voice. In other words, when you have taken psilocybin, you become aware of the power of your speech, of what comes out of your mouth, of the sounds. Um, and then obviously, the as with other hallucinogens, the music has a serious impact on the visions, on the experience. And this is also true for in the Amazon. People would not dream of taking ayahuasca and then there being no music, not singing Icaros or not playing an instrument. The idea that you would take ayahuasca and then just spend the whole evening in silence um, is not part of their culture. Um, and I think that that's also been fairly clear for most people interested in psychedelics. And in fact, have had a big impact on kinds of music that people have made as well. So clearly, there's something that's going on between music and the world of vision. There's another fellow who wrote another interesting book and brought up an important point about music and hallucinations. His name is Benny Shannon, and his book is The Antipodes of the Mind, Charting the Phenomenology of the Ayahuasca Experience. It also sounds fairly academic, but it's a pretty enjoyable read. And the point he makes about music is that when you are in the hallucinatory uh, realm or experience, everything can be transformed in terms of images, sounds, tastes. All the senses can experience transformation, and more or less anything in the outside world can seem transformed. The only thing that does not cease being itself is music. Music remains recognizable as music. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why ayahuasqueros tell people if the visions get too strong, then hang on to the melody. It's like a lifeline. You may be drowning in your visions. Well, concentrate on the melody and just hold on to that melody, and it'll get you out of the tough spot. Um, and so there, I think music may also be central for the reason that it remains fairly constant, unlike most everything else in the hallucinatory realm. Well, East, it was a pleasure talking with you too, and I hope we get to talk again.